Thanks for getting through all of this with us this morning. I'm going to hand it off to our incredible speaker, Kelsey, very soon. But if you stick around to the end of the event, there's going to be a super special announcement. So it's definitely worth hanging out to hear all of that. But yeah, Kelsey Oesmann is our speaker today. Like I said, she's going to be at Nashville Design Week if you need to see more of her after what's going to be an incredible talk. And she's going to speak to us about places where design really matters, designing for humans, things like affordable housing. And we know in Nashville that that's a huge crisis. And so I'm going to let Kelsey talk about all the things that make her great and how affordable design is great.
Good morning. My name is Kelsey Oesmann. I am an architect by training, a real estate developer by profession, and a community advocate by practice. When I first heard that the theme for this month was design, I was like, oof, I would hate to be the person who gets to talk about all of design. And here I am. So we're going to do this. I honestly feel like I'm preaching to the choir a little bit this morning. I'm more often in spaces where I'm trying to convince people that design matters and that it's worth investing in, and that it can really be transformative. But y'all already know that. So I'm going to dig into that a little bit more and talk about how that shows up in the work that I do. I came to design and architecture in particular because in high school, somebody told me it would be a good balance of my artistic creative side and my problem solving, puzzle loving side, and that I could make money at it. And I know Colin promised jokes this morning, so there's one for you. But I'm really glad that I kind of took a chance on it. 5 years of school later and 3 years of internships and 7 exams, I can officially call myself a licensed architect, which is kind of cool sometimes. But I think if I really knew what I wanted to design, I might have taken a little bit of a different path. So it took a while to kind of get where I am, but design to me is a lot of different things. It's a practice and a profession. It's a process. It's can be a service. It's a tool and a way of thinking, and sometimes a way of being and living. It can be a culture. It's the process of dreaming and planning and creating and curating, and it leads to making and designing and building. And hopefully that's building a better future. And I think to me, it really at its core is just a series of intentional decisions. And the question that I've been asking more recently is who gets to make those decisions, right? Like who's qualified or eligible or authorized to make design decisions? Do you have to have a degree or a certification or some other qualification that makes you a designer? When I worked for an architecture firm in the DC area, we did a lot of work for very wealthy developers. And it often felt like they were actually the ones making the decisions because they had the money and the power. And we could advocate all we wanted for things like sustainability and human scale and quality materials. But if it didn't pencil for them at the end of the day, it wasn't happening. And that was also a factor in where I am today. And so if it's about making decisions and who's making those, then we also have to ask who we're making those decisions for and who they're impacting and to what effect. And if design to me is really about making decisions and people in power get to make those, then design is power. And at its best, I think design is inclusive and inspiring and can be revolutionary and transformative. And one of my favorite examples of that is the simple curb. It's ubiquitous and utilitarian, just chunks of concrete and brick or granite if you're really fancy. But if you've ever been walking with a rolling suitcase in hand or pushing a stroller or in a wheelchair or maybe towing a cart or wagon or hand truck or bicycle, you have probably benefited from the work of a man named Ed Roberts. Ed was born in the 30s, and as a teenager, he caught polio, and it left him paralyzed from the neck down. and relying on an iron lung to breathe and really to survive. But in 1962, he decided that he wanted to attend UC Berkeley, and the university said that they didn't physically have a place for him. There was nowhere that could accommodate him and his physical needs. And eventually they figured out that they could house him in a converted patient room in the campus hospital, which is obviously not an ideal living situation for a student. But his presence on campus really unlocked the possibility for other students with disabilities to attend. And so soon there was kind of this cohort of students with disabilities that came to call themselves the Rolling Quads, which I also love that they kind of took ownership of that identity in a way that really surprised people at the time. But in spite of their ability to navigate a world that really wasn't designed for them, there were still very real physical barriers to getting around campus, including curbs. And so in an example of what we would now call tactical urbanism, Roberts and the Rolling Quads took it upon themselves to make curb cuts, to physically jackhammer and mix concrete, often under cover of night, which I find spooky and romantic and wonderful, to make a stretch of the main street more accessible. And you might have seen some examples of this kind of tactical urbanism here in Nashville, courtesy of the Civic Design Center and their Turbo group. But I think that design is also often just about showing people what's possible. I think sometimes we're too close to a problem to see beyond what that problem is, to see what's beyond the status quo and imagine something different. But back to Berkeley, through a combination of that kind of tactical urbanism and political activism, Roberts and the Rolling Quads, sounds like a band name, were able to advocate for the city to install curb cuts. And this idea of the curb cut effect, that when we design specifically for people with disabilities, we make life better for everyone, is really, I think, about designing not for the average, but for the extremes. So nobody is average, and average is a myth, it's impossible. And so by designing for people, for a spectrum, we can really meet a broader range of needs. But I think there's also a question here about what else happens? Like, what are the other ripples? Because when we installed these curb cuts, it also created another challenge for people who are blind and relied on that hard edge of curb to tell when the sidewalk ends. So now we have these detectable warnings, those raised bumps at the edges of platforms and steps and sidewalks to tell when there's a change in surface. And I think as designers, ideally, we're thinking about all those ripples and we're designing for them, but we also have to be humble enough to know when we've actually designed another challenge to solve. And I think it also begs the question about who are we prioritizing? Because in all of these situations, we're still bringing the pedestrian down to the level of the car, right? And what if we actually elevated the pedestrian and told the car to pause or wait or slow down? Who are we prioritizing? And all of these are questions of design. This is also design. In the 1930s and 40s, the Homeowner Loan Corporation, which is a federal agency, made these residential security maps. And they told lenders which parts of the city had greater risk of lending mortgages, from green areas, which were relatively safe and secure and also predominantly white, followed by blue areas that were still desirable, and then red, which were declining because of an influx of people of color, and finally red, that was hazardous and mostly Black. And these maps were used to systemically deny mortgages in Black neighborhoods in a process called redlining. And if you fast forward, we still see the implications of these design decisions in the policy world, when we know that in 2018, the Black homeownership rate in Nashville was 43% compared to 72% of white families. And this, again, was a design decision. And so I think that the good news is that we can also start to design solutions for this. One of the projects that I've been working on for the past couple of years is called The Game of Rent. It's a board game style teaching tool that is really just designed to help communities have better conversations about affordable housing, which can sometimes be a controversial or very complicated subject. And so in the game, people are given a new identity. So you get a new occupation and a new family and new life circumstances. And based on that, you're challenged to find somewhere you can afford to live that's close to work as quickly as possible. And so you pull neighborhood cards until either everybody at your table has found somewhere to live or you run out of cards, which then begs the question of what do people do when housing options run out? And the design premise of this game is really pretty simple. It's local data. So it started in Nashville, but now it's customized for 26 other cities, plus the luck of the draw, to raise awareness for what's actually happening and empathy for people who are impacted by it. And in the before times, I had the privilege of playing the game with a lot of different groups, from students to other designers and developers and city councilors and commissioners. And it was really interesting to see the different conversations that were sparked by this. But my favorite story was a table that had one person who kept pulling neighborhood card after neighborhood card and couldn't find somewhere that they could live. And when they finally found somewhere that worked for them, the entire table cheered. And what if that was how we could actually approach our communities and approach housing in our neighborhoods? That we were rooting for our neighbors and we were excited and celebrated when people had the resources to access the housing that they needed. To me, it often comes back to this idea of dignity. What if we could design that kind of community that really was welcoming and celebrated a diversity of people and their housing needs? And if dignity is the goal and the aspiration of design, I think we have a lot of work to do, because we keep designing spaces and places that have glass ceilings and steep stairs instead of ramps, and then we ask why everyone at the top looks the same. And this question of dignity is what my work in affordable housing, to me, is really all about. So in my day job, I work for an organization called Urban Housing Solutions. We're celebrating our 30th anniversary this year, and we're a nonprofit affordable housing provider. So we have, for 30 years, been working to meet unmet housing needs across the city of Nashville. Historically, that's been a lot more kind of specific needs of folks who are coming from homelessness or have some other complicating factor in their housing search. But now we're really just trying to keep up with the pace of growth and rising cost of living here in Nashville. I know that it's a little early for statistics, so I'll just use one, that by 2030, we're looking at needing an additional 44,000 homes in Nashville that are affordable to low and moderate income neighbors. And that's a lot. So again, we're doing what we can. And one of the projects that has been really a joy to work on in my time with UHS is 26 in Clarksville in North Nashville. It's just before you cross the bridge into Bordeaux. And when UHS acquired the property in 2014, it had been abandoned and used for illegal dumping by the previous owner. So when we purchased the property, we went through a kind of visioning process with neighbors in the community and landed on an intergenerational and arts-inspired community. And to kickstart that vision of a place where people of all ages and backgrounds could come together through a common creative purpose, we took the opportunity before we demolished the last building to do an arts installation called Demographics. So local artists were invited to take over one of the apartments and make it their own gallery or canvas before the buildings were ceremoniously demolished. And that made way for our new plan. We went through a pretty extensive planning process, working with an awesome architecture firm out of the Bay Area called David Baker Architects, really working to refine the concept to make it more walkable and respond to all the different conditions around the property. And this is where we are today. So 6 years and $25 million later, we have 141 new affordable apartments on this location. It's transit accessible. It's always our #1 priority. And again, we're really trying to move forward towards that vision of an intergenerational and arts-inspired community. And it started again with a mural that was on the construction fence around that first phase in 2017. We worked with a nonprofit called Southern Word, who is amazing. And they worked with local students to create poetry about what it means to love a city. And then that was turned into the mural that went around the whole property. And although this mural was temporary, we do have a current mural on the property that was done by North Art Collective that really celebrates the neighborhood's legacy of the civil rights movement. So this building opened in 2017. It's 23 apartments, which for us is pretty small, but we're really happy with how it all turned out. The second phase opened in September of 2018 and added 63 more apartments and 6,500 square feet of commercial space, which we also love to do because we know how much that can contribute to a neighborhood. This building also was our first step in kind of creating an intentional carve out for working artists and creatives. So it has a separate priority waiting list for folks who are in that space. And then phase 3 opened in September 2020, which is great timing. But this building is really near and dear to me. It's our first building that's dedicated for older adults. So everyone who lives here is 62 and up. And most of them are supported by project-based housing assistance. So they pay 1/3 of their income, even if that's just Social Security, which leaves enough left over for everything else that they need. And this building was also kind of a step in putting a stake in the ground in a neighborhood where people are being displaced really rapidly and finding a way to create a home for folks who want to stay and age in the community, but otherwise wouldn't have the ability to do so. And this was also an exercise in intentionality when it came to design for accessibility and durability and sustainability. And I think one of the most beautiful things that has come out of it is seeing the ownership that residents have taken of the building, both in kind of curating the plants in the building and also decorating their front doors for holidays and getting to see bits of their personality. We really have some of the most incredible folks living here. And one of them, being a retired educator, has also created different displays in the common areas throughout the year, including this one for Black History Month, which actually included an article about one of the other residents who's one of the first students to integrate in Nashville. And so there's a ton of history in this neighborhood that we're trying to capture in kind of small ways in this development. This phase also included a standalone community building in the center of the site that has a teaching kitchen and a multi-purpose room. And again, unfortunately, because of COVID, we haven't really been able to program it the way that we want to, but we were really excited this past weekend to be able to host the North Nash Fall Bash, which is our first community event. We had residents from phase 3, the senior building, come out and volunteer. One of our resident artists emceed the event. And it was really just an incredible opportunity to bring folks together in exactly the way that we had designed the space to do. So again, it comes back to this idea of dignity. Not creating dignity, but just recognizing and celebrating and highlighting and making space for the inherent dignity in people and places. So how do we do this? At UHS, we are designing for collaboration because nothing we do is without partnership. This is too big of a problem for one person or one organization to tackle. And so we have the benefit of working with some really amazing community partners, including the city, to pull these kinds of things off. We're designing for sustainability. We know that as developers, we have a responsibility, and as designers as well, And so these buildings are designed to Energy Star standards. We were able to do solar panels on phase 3 for the first time, which is really exciting. And we know that, it's nice to be able to put a LEED plaque on a fancy downtown building, but if we can save our residents $10 a month on their utility bills, that can make a huge difference. So again, that's the impact of design. We're also designing for accessibility. Again, phase 3 was a really big exercise in that. And we also have speed tables on the property. So again, elevating that pedestrian experience and prioritizing people over cars. We're designing for connectivity. Again, transit is a huge factor for us, but also in the age of COVID, we recognize how important internet access is. So as we're pre-wiring all of our future buildings, we were also able to provide internet service for our senior residents and give them all iPads when they moved in so that they could still access that health and wellness programming and stay connected to friends and family when we weren't able to gather in person. We also know that this idea of connectivity is not just infrastructure, it's people. And so providing all sorts of different spaces, whether it's a small balcony for you to gather with your neighbor and sit and have coffee in the morning, or that community building to attend an exercise class or a cooking class. More recently, we've been focused on designing for resilience. We were really fortunate in March of 2020 to escape major damage from the tornadoes, but we haven't been so lucky with other storms. We've had to deal with wind damage and flooding and lightning strikes on the same building twice, which I was always told was not supposed to happen. And so we're looking at ways that we can make sure that we're protecting our residents and their homes, especially knowing that these weather events are going to continue to happen with increasing severity and frequency. And this looks like small things like adding a package locker at one of our locations where folks are starting to order online more due to COVID, and doing post-occupancy evaluation so that we're checking in and making sure that we're being responsive to the changing needs of our residents. And at the end of the day, we're designing for people, right? Because we believe that having a place to call home can change everything. Thanks. Am I still on camera?
Right. Amazing. I'm not going to clap directly into the mic because that seems like an insane thought. But yeah, there were so many things that you touched on in that I thought was really amazing. And especially when you showed that area that was set up in the apartment building for the Black History Month moment and like talking about one of the first integrated people in Nashville and things like that. I just like the fact that something like that happened during COVID time is like really amazing because you said it opened in September. Like that was
great timing.
Peak not knowing what was going on. So that's really amazing that people still had a sense of community during that time and they wanted to build things together. That's really cool. So yeah. So yeah, we're going to check on the chat. And so if anyone has any questions, we would love to see what's going on and ask some questions to people or ask some questions for Kelsey. I know. Yeah. Nice. Yeah. So does anyone have any questions for Kelsey? I know you talked about how you're like designing for people is a big thing and like prioritizing people over cars, which I thought is really great. So like before I lived in Nashville, I lived in New York, which is definitely more of like a pedestrian friendly city. So like, I don't know. I feel like Nashville's not super pedestrian friendly and like just walkable in general, like maybe a couple pockets, like we have a couple greenways.
Mm-hmm.
I used to live on the west side and walk around that golf course. But what are some of your like big hopes and dreams for Nashville as a whole, I guess, and like thinking about that like more people-centered planning?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I moved here from DC, so I feel your pain about moving from a very walkable area to here. I used to bike commute in DC and I loved it, and definitely don't feel comfortable doing that here. So I think some of it is definitely infrastructure, things like bike lanes, especially protected bike lanes, so that we keep cars and more vulnerable vehicles separate. I think a lot of it is about sidewalks, because as much as we need a really robust and regional transit system, if you can't safely walk to the nearest bus stop, then that transit system doesn't do you much good. So it's the combination of transit and pedestrian infrastructure, of sidewalks, especially sidewalks that don't have like power poles in the middle of them, because that's not helpful. So there's a lot that we can be doing that I hope with new investment will happen, because again, it's about connecting people to everything else that they need. And making sure that those investments are equitable. So that you mentioned the West Side, I've seen a lot of really great kind of segments of bike lanes, but which neighborhoods are getting those bike lanes, and who's able to access them becomes the question.
Yeah. All right. We have another question. This one's from Manuel Zeitlin. Do residents typically live in your developments for a long time, and do you help them transition to home ownership?
That's a great question. So it's a mix. We don't cap any kind of tenure for our residents. So we do have folks who've lived with us for 20 plus years, and we love residents like that. We also have folks who are using an affordable apartment as a stepping stone to homeownership. That's not something that we provide, but we do have some really great partners locally, like Affordable Housing Resources and Habitat for Humanity, that can be that kind of next step. But it's really hard to save up for a down payment when you're spending half of your income on rent. And so our goal is really to make sure that folks are not housing cost burden. They're not paying more than a third of their income for housing, so that then they can save up for whatever comes next, whether that's buying a home or starting a business or starting a family. So it's a mix of both.
Okay. Our next question is from Valerie. What projects are you currently working on?
So our latest project is under construction right now. It's on Dickerson Pike, not too far from Studio 615. That's 147 apartments called the Skyliner, and that will begin pre-leasing soon. So if you or anyone you know is looking for housing, stay tuned and keep an eye out for that one. We're really excited about it. And then we have a 70-unit project down in South Nashville, and we're actually undertaking the complete redevelopment of our original home. We started in 1991 with the conversion of an old motel property called the Mercury Motel. It was converted to single room occupancy units for folks who were coming directly from homelessness. And the buildings were built in the 60s, and so they are in need of major investment. And so the plan is to completely redevelop that site while minimizing displacement for the residents who are there, and create a more dense and diverse kind of mixed affordable for us. Everything we do is affordable, but we also recognize that there's struggles at the 30% of income range, and then there's struggles all the way up to more market rate. And so being able to capture a broader range of folks there. But in everything we do, again, prioritizing pedestrians and walkability and sustainability. But those are the big ones we've got right now.
We have one other question from Kristen Chen. Kelsey, the new community space is beautiful. Can you talk more about how UHS landed on the design and programming of that central resident community space?
Yes. So that we called it a jewel box for a while. It was supposed to be this little building in the center of the site that was accessible to everybody. And once we started really digging into the design of it and budget constraints, we had to be really intentional about how much space was inside and going to be conditioned, and how we were connecting that to the outdoor space that is frankly cheaper to build, but as we saw this past weekend, no less effective in creating spaces for people to gather. So we really tried to create these big overhangs to kind of extend the building out into the rest of the development. But the core of it is really simple. It's just the multi-purpose room, the kitchen, a small office, and some infrastructure. So it's a pretty simple plan, but trying to make sure that it was distinct enough from the surrounding buildings that it really made it feel like that kind of jewel box that was the original intent.
Very cool. I guess this is a little more silly of a question in the context of everything we've been talking about. So you've been talking about designing for spaces particularly, but do you have a favorite neighborhood in Nashville or a favorite neighborhood you've like lived in or visited that you think like really nailed a lot of things for their community?
Yeah. So I'm partial to the east side. Our office is at Woodland and Ninth. So when I was moving here and had no idea about anything about Nashville, I basically put a pin in our office and drew a 1 mile circle. And I was like, this is where I'm living. I was still trying to, walk to work and bike commute. And so I ended up in a quadplex on Russell Street. It's an old brick building, and I love that neighborhood for a lot of reasons. It's walkable. It's super close to Five Points Pizza, and really good coffee. But I think the more that I learned about the neighborhood and got into the work that I'm doing at UHS, it's also a really great kind of missing middle neighborhood. It's a term that we use when we talk about zoning. A lot of our zoning in Nashville is single family zoning, which is really exclusive. And it increases the cost of housing because you can only put one house on what is now a very expensive piece of land. And so in the historic Edgefield neighborhood where I was living, you had all sorts of different mixes of like, you could have the building that I lived in, which felt like a house-sized building, but it had 4 units in it. And so instead of housing one family, you're housing 4 on a similar piece of land. And so I think that the ability of that neighborhood to capture like a lot of different housing types, but still feel kind of cohesive is just a really interesting case study. So, and they have great trees.
Yeah. No, big fan of trees.
Yeah, trees are great.
I'm so sorry for that sentence, everybody. Big fan of trees. But I mean, I lived in New York, so I had all the parks there, and I was in Atlanta for a while as well, which has like a ridiculous amount of green space. And I think they're doing pretty good as a city in that way. The traffic is terrible, but I feel like it is a little more accessible, especially like the Beltline and like things that they've been doing lately. Atlanta got very cool after I left, so Colin gets to enjoy all of that now. Very jealous of him. But all right, do we have any other questions? Yep, big tree fan. Thanks, guys, for also adding that to the chat. I'm glad we've got some tree fans in the house.
We love trees. Trees are great. Trees are great for reducing the heat island effect, for providing our shade canopy.
What's the heat island?
Oh, the heat island effect.
It sounds like a reality show.
Is why New York City is generally like 10 to 15 degrees warmer than other places. So basically, when we have so much concrete and asphalt, it captures and holds all of the heat from the sun, that solar radiation, and then it releases back out. And so when we have more trees and more shade, then it keeps our city cooler, and so we don't have to spend as much on heating and cooling, and it's just a more pleasant place to be. So I'm a shade hopper, so I will walk specifically on the shady side of the street in the summer, and then the sunny side in the winter. So
I'm the same way. When I first moved here from Brooklyn, I lived in Germantown because I was like, this feels walkable. And I can walk to a grocery, walk to a drugstore. And I didn't know that downtown was hellacious. I hadn't lived here yet, but I was a mile from like Bridgestone and Broadway. And so I could walk downtown to like go out if I wanted to. And that was really important to me transitioning from like a much more accessible city. Is like, if I move somewhere where immediately I can't do anything. I don't know if I would have made it here, but I got a car when I moved to the West. I made a whole year without one.
Nice.
So
That's impressive.
yeah,
I almost
it's
sold
a
my
lot.
car when I was in DC, and then I moved here and I
Ooh.
was like, oh, I'm
Yeah.
glad I did get rid of that.
I know. I have a friend who moved from, she did the opposite. She moved from Nashville to New York and she's like, what if I can't make it? And so she left her car with her dad and was like, in 2 months, you can sell it if I figured it out and I have a job, but don't sell it yet in case I have to come back because like won't make it in Nashville without one.
That's fair.
Yeah, it's a lot. All right. Got another question. This is from Melissa Cherry. What do you think is the biggest misconception about low wage housing?
Oh,
I know.
there's so many.
Big question.
I think to sum it up, it's a, a perception that people are lazy or that they're, not working. It's one of the reasons why I hate the term workforce housing. It's generally used to refer to people who are a little bit higher on the income kind of spectrum. But then it implies that folks who are below that level are not in the workforce, which is largely untrue. They're just working jobs that don't pay them enough to live in market rate housing in Nashville. So it's folks who are staffing our brand new hotels downtown who are literally building the buildings that they then can't afford to live in. And so I think it's that perception that it's a free ride. Like all of our residents pay rent in some form or fashion, and it's not that folks are not working hard. They're some of the hardest working people that I've had the pleasure of meeting. We just have a really big disconnect between our wages and our housing costs. And if we could just pay people more, then that would go a long way.
Yeah. If we could just pay people, it's so simple when you phrase it that way. And
Yeah.
yet, well, thank you so much. Is there anything last minute you want to share with, oh, we do have one more question. All right, cool. Is it easy for residents to get into one of the houses or is there like red tape or like, what's that process look like? And that's from Karenina Gonzalez.
Yeah, that's a great question. I would say it unfortunately depends, which is part of the problem, right? Like UHS is one of a couple of organizations that provide the kind of housing that we do. But each of us and each of the funding mechanisms that we use sometimes have different requirements. So we could have a building that has 20 units and there would be 20 different rent levels because of the way that the project is structured and the size of the unit. So it gets really complicated. My my best answer is to just call the organization and find out from a real human what you're looking at because it can be really complicated. I know the city is working on kind of streamlining that process to the same way that if you apply to college with the Common App, you've got one application and everybody sees the same information. That would really help kind of cut down on some of that confusion and red tape. And it's this tension between like we need the public funding to be able to build the buildings that we build, but the public funding also comes with these strings and requirements, which is great for accountability to make sure that that money is being used for the purpose that it was intended and serving the people who need it. But it also can cause, again, these, that's why we need those detectable warnings, right? It's the other ripple effects of solving one problem, but creating another challenge.
All right. Well, thank you so
Yeah.
much for talking with us about this. Again, I feel like we could talk all day about just what everything that it touches because like housing and humans and living, even just the word living, like there's so many things that entails in terms of like what people need and what can be provided. But it's really cool that you're working on so many projects to help give people what they need. And then do you want to talk a little about your Nashville Design Week event that you have coming up?
Sure. Yeah, so on Thursday of next week, we'll have a panel discussion with a couple of other folks just talking kind of similar about, I'm biased, but I think design matters most in affordable housing. And so that's the topic of our panel discussion. So we'll be talking about some of the kind of specific strategies that we've used to make sure that our designs are having the impact that we want them to, and really kind of stretching all of our resources. So I'll have a couple of different perspectives on that. And then on Friday morning of Design Week, we have started a podcast about resilience. And so we'll have a panel discussion about everything that has happened in Nashville over the past 2 years and how we're responding and things we're learning, so that we can build back better and build a stronger city and a better community for all of us. And if I could just make one plug,
Please, please, please.
I think I often get the question of like, this is such a huge problem. What can I do about it? And I think that one of the best things that we can do is to advocate. We really need to make sure that this issue is front of mind for, again, people who are making those decisions, whether it's design or policy or funding. And so talk to your council member, talk to your elected state officials or national representatives, and let them know that this is a challenge and this is a problem that you want to see investment in that, because the only way that we're going to make any significant difference at scale is if we have the political will behind it. So that's my plug.
So you heard it. You can participate in the community and in politics and advocacy, and even just, I think, continuing educating yourself by going to things like Nashville Design Week. That's going to help you participate better as well. So thank you for joining us this morning. And I have one more announcement. This is for the Creative Mornings folks. And for those of you who chose to be here today, thank you so much for joining us for what is hopefully our very, 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 very last virtual event. That is right. You're the first to hear it, unless you saw that Instagram story where we accidentally mentioned it very briefly. This is our last virtual event. We have gotten the clearance from Creative Mornings headquarters in New York to be back in person. And we're going to be doing so with safety protocols so that Nashville's biggest breakfastist community can be safe and lovely as we finally get to resume high fives and breakfast and talking with other humans and not just a sea of boxes. So keep your eyes out and on our Instagram and your email and all those good places, because we're going to be having our November event a little early just so we don't overlap with the Thanksgiving holidays. That'll be November 19th, I believe that's the Friday before Thanksgiving. And it will be a hybrid style event because we're only going to release a few tickets. Just not a few, but we're going to release a smaller amount of tickets than we have for our in-person events in the past, just to, again, make sure people can space and feel distanced and safe. And then we will be still streaming it live for those of you who either can't come or who, still are not quite ready to be re-entering a big room, but we're going to be at one of our other favorite spaces, Center 615, and we have an incredible speaker lined up already. And so get ready to be back. We're so excited. There'll obviously wait list, still sign up. Who knows? Stuff happens. People get out and realize that they have a flat tire and they're not going to make it in the morning. You never know, but we'll also be giving away some tickets to make sure that some people definitely are able to attend. So again, keep an eye on our socials, and we are so excited to see you all again and give you breakfast and air fives and who knows what spice, because it's our first virtual event or our first in-person, God, I've been saying virtual for too long. It's our first in-person event in almost 2 years. Can you even? So I'm very sorry, I have my phone in my hand because I was reading questions, but it's our first in-person event in almost 2 years, and we absolutely cannot wait. It's so soon. And thank you so much for being here today. And hopefully I get to see you in person in just a couple of weeks for our November event. The theme is liminal. So let's expand our brains and even consider what that means. All right. Thanks so much, guys. I hope you have a great rest of your Friday. We're done a little early today. So go think about some important questions while looking at the rain and sipping something warm, because it finally feels like autumn out there. Maybe it's a hot cider. Maybe it's a hot toddy. It is Friday. It's been a hell of a week.